June 22, 1944. 3 years to the day since Germany had launched Operation Barbarossa and sent 3 million soldiers east into the Soviet Union. 3 years since the largest land invasion in history had begun with sunrise that lit up the entire western border of the USSR and did not stop burning for 4 years. On this particular morning in 1944, Field Marshal Ernst Busch, commanding Germany's Army Group Center on the Eastern Front, was at his headquarters in Minsk. His front stretched nearly 700 miles from the Pripyat marshes in the south to the upper reaches of the Dwina River in the north. He commanded approximately 800,000 men in 3 armies and 1 Panzer Army. Behind him lay Belarus, the territory that separated the front from Warsaw from the borders of Germany itself. Busch had received intelligence reports throughout the spring indicating that the main Soviet summer offensive would fall in the south against Army Group North Ukraine, against the oil fields and the industrial centers of Galicia. The intelligence was consistent. Multiple sources confirmed it. His own assessment aligned with it. The Soviets had been massing armor in the south. The supply convoys had been moving south. The radio traffic patterns pointed south. The intelligence was what the Soviets had spent 6 months building it to be. At 5 in the morning, 2.4 million Soviet soldiers moved forward along a 350-mile front directly into Army Group Center. They were supported by 5,200 tanks, 5,300 aircraft, and 36,000 artillery pieces, a density of firepower no army in the history of warfare had ever attempted to concentrate on a single axis of attack. The artillery preparation that opened the assault lasted for hours. The men in the German forward positions who survived the first minutes described it afterward, in the few cases where there were men to describe it, as the end of the world rendered in sound. Field Marshal Busch was not asleep when it began. But what he faced in the first hours was something that the architecture of his intelligence picture had made genuinely impossible for him to process correctly. He was being hit where his intelligence had told him he would not be hit, by forces whose size his intelligence had told him did not exist, with a weight of firepower his intelligence had not identified in the sector now burning in front of him. By the end of the first day, the front had been penetrated in 6 places. By the end of the third day, German divisions were being encircled. By the end of the first week, the situation had moved past the vocabulary of military reversal into something that required a different word entirely. This is the story of Operation Bagration. It is the story of the largest offensive operation in the history of warfare. It is the story of how the Soviet Union destroyed an entire German army group in 2 weeks. And it is, above everything else, the story of how they made Germany look in the wrong direction for 6 months before the first artillery round was fired. To understand what happened in June 1944 on the Eastern Front, you have to understand what the Eastern Front had become by the spring of that year. The clean narrative of the German invasion, the great encirclement battles of 1941, the drive toward Moscow, toward Leningrad, toward Stalingrad, had given way by 1944 to something harder to map and harder to explain. The front was no longer moving in one direction. It was moving in both directions at once, in different sectors at different times. And the army that had crossed the Soviet border 3 years earlier with a doctrine of lightning war and an assumption of 6-week victory was now holding a line that stretched from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea. Army Group Center's section of that line had a characteristic that Soviet planners had been studying since the winter. It bulged westward. The German positions in Belarus projected toward the east in a salient whose nose pointed at Moscow and whose flanks were exposed to pressure from both north and south. The salient had been formed by the German retreats of 1943, when Army Groups North and South had been pushed back while Army Group Center had held. What it meant in the spring of 1944 was that Army Group Center was occupying a geographic position that, if the flanks could be cut, would trap everything inside it. The Soviet planners who designed Operation Bagration understood this. What they needed was for the Germans not to understand it until the flanks were already cut. The operation that accomplished this was called Maskirovka. The word translates approximately as camouflage or concealment, but the military meaning is broader than either English word captures. Maskirovka was the Soviet doctrine of military deception in its most comprehensive form. It covered physical concealment of forces, false signals intelligence, disinformation through captured agents and planted documents, deception at the operational and strategic level simultaneously, and the patient, systematic construction of a false picture in the enemy's intelligence system that would cause and position his forces incorrectly. The Soviet Union had been developing Maskirovka doctrine since the early 1930s. By 1944, it had become, along with artillery mass and deep battle theory, one of the three central pillars of Soviet operational art. The men who ran it were not propagandists. They were professional military officers who had spent years studying how German intelligence collected information, what sources it trusted, what patterns it looked for, and how a false picture could be constructed that would survive the cross-referencing process that German intelligence applied to what it received. The Maskirovka operation for Bagration began in the spring of 1944 and operated simultaneously on multiple levels. At the strategic level, the Soviets built a false picture of offensive preparation in the south. Genuine armor concentrations in the Army Group North Ukraine sector were reinforced with additional genuine forces, creating a massing in the south that German aerial reconnaissance could confirm and that signals intelligence could partially verify. The south was not a complete fabrication. There was going to be a Soviet offensive in the south as well. The deception was in the timing and the weight. The south was real but secondary. The north was the main event, and it was being made to look like nothing was happening. At the operational level, in the Belarus sector, the movement of forces was conducted with a discipline that the Soviet Army of 1941 had been incapable of, and that the Soviet Army of 1944 had learned through catastrophic experience. All major movement of men and equipment into the assembly areas for Bagration was conducted at night. Vehicles moved without headlights on roads that had been mapped in advance specifically for their concealment from aerial observation. Aircraft flew constant patrols over the assembly areas during daylight to prevent German reconnaissance from penetrating the cover. Deception units operated in the rear areas using radio traffic to simulate the presence of armies that were not there and mass movement of armies that were. The radio discipline was particularly significant. The Soviet command had learned from its own signals intelligence work that German radio intercept units were among the most competent in the world. The German Signals Intelligence Service, the Horchtdienst, had broken enough Soviet radio procedures over 3 years of war to develop reliable signatures for Army-level and front-level headquarters. If a Soviet Army headquarters transmitted on its known frequencies from a known location, German signals intelligence could place that headquarters with confidence. The Soviets used this against the Germans. Army-level headquarters, whose actual staffs had moved to Bagration assembly areas, maintained radio silence or transmitted low-level administrative traffic from their previous locations. German signals intelligence tracking the headquarters of armies, it was concerned about found them where they had been, transmitting at routine levels, apparently not preparing for major operations. The actual attack forces moved in silence. At the tactical level, the final assembly of forces in the forward areas was accomplished in the days immediately before the offensive through a series of night movements of extraordinary precision. Artillery, the primary indicator of offensive preparation because of the volume and weight of guns required, was moved into position in the final 48 hours. Camouflage discipline was maintained at a level that German aerial reconnaissance, operating under increased fighter pressure and cloudy spring weather, could not reliably penetrate. A German officer who survived the opening of the offensive and was later interrogated described the experience of the first hours in terms that illuminate what Maskirovka had accomplished. He said that the artillery preparation began without the warning that should have preceded it. There had been no observed registration fire in the previous days. The Soviet guns that hit his positions had not been ranged in the normal manner. They had been pre-registered by other means, by survey, by calculation, and they had arrived accurate from the first round without the adjusting fire that a German observer should have been able to detect and report. He was describing the result of a decision the Soviet artillery commanders had made weeks before the offensive. Registration fire, the process of adjusting artillery on target before a battle, would have told German observers that guns were being positioned in their sector. The Soviets had chosen to accept some reduction in first-round accuracy in exchange for complete surprise. On a front where they were outnumbering the defenders and artillery by ratios of 10 to 1 or more, the accuracy trade-off was acceptable. The surprise was not negotiable. The German intelligence picture in the spring of 1944 was not simply the result of Soviet deception. It was also the result of German analytical assumptions that Maskirovka had been specifically designed to exploit. German intelligence analysis of Soviet intentions in 1944 was shaped by 2 years of pattern recognition. The Soviets had consistently struck at the points where German lines were most extended and most vulnerable. The Kursk salient had been the obvious point in the summer of 1943, and the Soviets had struck at Kursk. The German retreat from Kursk had left Army Group South overextended, and the Soviets had struck Army Group South through the winter of 1943 and 1944. The pattern, as German analysts read it, pointed toward continued pressure on Army Group South and Army Group North Ukraine in the summer of 1944. Army Group Center did not fit the pattern. Its salient was deep, but its positions were relatively strong in terms of prepared defenses. Hitler had designated key towns within the Army Group Center sector as Festplätze, fortified places, strong points that were to be held regardless of flanking pressure. The doctrine of the Festplätze gave the Army Group Center sector an apparent solidity that German analysis read as reduced vulnerability. The Festplätze doctrine was itself a factor in the disaster. By designating towns as strong points to be held to the last, Hitler had pre-committed significant forces to fix positions that would become encirclements as soon as the mobile battle moved past them. The garrisons of Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk were ordered to hold in place as Soviet forces swept around and past them. Tens of thousands of men in each location were consumed defending positions that had ceased to have operational relevance the moment the front moved. This is what Field Marshal Bush faced on the morning of June 22nd, a doctrine that required him to hold fixed positions, an intelligence picture that had placed the main Soviet threat elsewhere, a front that was being hit everywhere simultaneously by a force whose size his intelligence had told him did not exist in this sector. The Soviet offensive had been designed by a committee of front commanders working under the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, coordinated by Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky. The two marshals divided the front between them, with Zhukov coordinating the southern portion of the Bagration front and Vasilevsky the northern portion. Below them, for front commanders ran the actual operations. The First Baltic Front under General Ivan Bagration attacked from the north toward Vitebsk. The Third Belarusian Front under General Ivan Cherniakovsky struck at Vitebsk from the east and drove toward Orsha. The Second Belarusian Front under General Georgy Zakharov attacked across the Dnieper toward Mogilev. The First Belarusian Front under Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, the largest and most powerful of the four, attacked from the south, driving toward Bobruisk and ultimately toward Minsk. The coordination between these four fronts was the operational achievement of the battle. They did not attack in sequence, which would have allowed German reserves to shift between threatened sectors. They attacked simultaneously, along a front so wide and with forces so large that German reserves could not be concentrated against any single penetration without uncovering another. The German operational response was hamstrung from the beginning by the Festplätze doctrine and by the absence of mobile reserves. Army Group Center's panzer formations were inadequate in number, and in many cases were committed to the fixed defense of the strong points rather than being held back for counterattack. When the Soviet armor began breaking through between the strong points, there were no mobile German forces available to seal the breaches. At Vitebsk in the north, the Soviet First Baltic and Third Belarusian fronts closed an encirclement around 5 German divisions within the first days of the offensive. Hitler ordered the garrison to hold. The garrison commander, General Friedrich Gallwitzer, was told that relief was coming. Relief was not coming. The ring tightened. By June 27th, the Vitebsk pocket had been reduced. Approximately 35,000 German soldiers were dead or captured. Gallwitzer was among the prisoners. At Bobruisk, in the south, Rokossovsky's First Belarusian Front encircled approximately 70,000 men of the German Ninth Army. The encirclement was completed with a rapidity that German operational accounts describe as almost incomprehensible to the men inside the pocket. Units that had been in contact with adjacent formations on the morning of June 24 found themselves cut off by Soviet armor on the morning of June 25th. The front had not retreated. The front had dissolved around them. The German attempt to break out of Barbarossa produced one of the most catastrophic single episodes of the entire Eastern Front War. A column of approximately 15,000 men, moving west along a road out of Barbarossa, was caught in the open by Soviet aircraft, the Sturmovix. The Soviet ground attack aircraft that had been the nightmare of German armor formations since Kursk worked the column for hours. The road was blocked at both ends. The men had nowhere to go. By the time the aircraft had finished and Soviet ground forces closed in, the road was impassable with wreckage. Approximately 10,000 of the men in that column did not survive the afternoon. The convergence of the four Soviet fronts toward Minsk was the operational objective that defined the battle's strategic significance. Minsk was not merely the capital of Belarus. It was the administrative and logistical center of Army Group Center's entire operational area. The roads and railways that connected the front to Germany ran through Minsk. If Minsk was taken, Army Group Center west of the city was cut off from supply and reinforcement. By July 3rd, 11 days after the offensive had begun, Soviet forces entered Minsk. East of the city, in the forests and marshes between the old front line and the new one, approximately 100,000 German soldiers were trapped without supply, without fuel for their vehicles, without a coherent chain of command. The encirclement east of Minsk was liquidated over the following weeks. Columns of prisoners moved west through Minsk and were eventually marched through Moscow in a formal display organized for precisely the symbolic effect achieved. The total German losses in Operation Bagration between June 22nd and the end of August 1944 have been the subject of historical debate since the war ended. The figures depend on what period is counted, which formations are included, and how prisoners taken in the follow-on operations are attributed. The most careful post-war accounting, drawing on German military records in the Bundesarchiv and Soviet archival material released after 1991, puts the German losses in the core Bagration period at approximately 350,000 to 400,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, with 28 divisions effectively destroyed as combat formations. These figures make Operation Bagration the largest single German defeat of the entire war, exceeding the losses at Stalingrad in both the number of men lost and the number of formations destroyed. The comparison to Stalingrad is worth dwelling on, because in the West the two operations are not equally remembered. Stalingrad has become the symbolic turning point of the Eastern Front, the battle that broke the back of the German offensive, the moment when the war in the East became unwinnable for Germany. This is accurate as a characterization of strategic significance. Stalingrad was the turning point of the German offensive, but Bagration was larger. More men lost, more formations destroyed, more territory recovered in a shorter time. And it was accomplished against a German army that had spent 2 years learning from Stalingrad, that had reorganized its defenses, that had developed better tactical procedures for exactly this kind of situation. The German army that was destroyed in Belarus in June and July of 1944 was not the overextended army of 1942. It was the experienced, adapted, deeply dug-in army of 1944, and it was destroyed in 2 weeks. The reason it was destroyed in 2 weeks has 2 parts. The first is the quality of the Soviet military by 1944. The army that had been shattered in the summer of 1941 had spent 3 years rebuilding itself around a different set of operational principles. The deep battle doctrine, the coordination of multiple fronts, the mass use of artillery, the integration of armor and infantry, the supply system that could sustain 4 simultaneous offensives over hundreds of miles. These were not the capabilities of the Soviet army that had faced Barbarossa. They were capabilities that had been built through catastrophic experience at the cost of casualties that no Western army of the period could have sustained and continued to function. The second part is Maskirovka. The German army in 1944 retained, in many respects, the technical and tactical qualities that had made it the most effective land force in the world in 1940 and 1941. Its soldiers were experienced. Its officers were competent. Its doctrine had adapted. What it could no longer compensate for was a strategic intelligence failure of the magnitude that Maskirovka had engineered. When an army is positioned to meet a threat in the south, and the threat comes from the north, tactical excellence at the point of contact cannot recover the situation. The troops are in the wrong place. The reserves are in the wrong place. The supply arrangements are oriented in the wrong direction. By the time the correct picture becomes clear, the battle has already been decided in the operational planning rooms where it was designed. Field Marshal Bush was relieved of command on June 28, 6 days after the offensive began. He was replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model, who was known throughout the German army as the fireman, the officer sent to stabilize collapsing fronts. Model arrived in Belarus to find that the front he had been sent to stabilize had, in the weeks since the offensive began, ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Model's assessment, communicated to Hitler on the day of his arrival, was that Army Group Center required immediate reinforcement of a minimum of 7 panzer divisions and 7 infantry divisions to stabilize the situation. The reinforcements were not available. What Model received was significantly less, and it arrived too late and piecemeal to reverse what had already happened. What he did with what he had was a subject of considerable admiration among German officers who observed it. He stopped the complete disintegration of the front. He established a new defensive line, substantially to the west of where the old one had been. He prevented Operation Bagration from becoming the complete destruction of the German position in the east rather than the destruction of Army Group Center. But he could not restore what had been lost. The 28 divisions were gone. The territory was gone. The 350 miles of depth that separated the new front from the old one were gone. And Minsk was gone, along with the administrative infrastructure that had sustained Army Group Center for 3 years of Eastern Front war. The Maskirovka operation that had made all of this possible is worth examining in its specifics, not as a catalog of deception techniques, but as an illustration of what a mature intelligence system and a patient operational command can accomplish when they work together correctly. The Germans, in the spring of 1944, had access to multiple intelligence sources about Soviet intentions: aerial reconnaissance, signals intelligence, agent reports, prisoner interrogation, observation of Soviet logistical patterns. Each of these sources was providing information. The information was being analyzed by competent professionals. The analytical conclusion that the main Soviet summer offensive would fall in the South was not the product of carelessness or incompetence. It was the product of a picture that the Soviets had spent months constructing to lead to exactly that conclusion. The genius of Maskirovka, at its best, is not that it creates false information. It is that it shapes the real information that the enemy collects. The aerial reconnaissance of Soviet positions in the South was real. The forces the Germans saw massing there were real. The radio traffic patterns they intercepted were real transmissions. The agent reports they received described genuine activity. The falseness was not in any single source. It was in the overall picture that the sources assembled to, which was oriented toward the South, because the Soviets had oriented the collectible indicators toward the South, while moving the actual offensive forces into position in the North under conditions of concealment that prevented the real picture from being assembled. A German intelligence officer working from accurate sources in the spring of 1944 would have concluded correctly that the South was being reinforced and that offensive preparations were underway there. He would have concluded correctly that the North was relatively quiet. His conclusions from accurate information would have been accurate. The inaccuracy was structural, built into the pattern of what was collectible rather than into any individual piece of collected intelligence. This is the hardest kind of deception to detect, and the most devastating when it works. There is no single false document to be exposed. There is no turned agent to be identified. There is a pattern of real activity that has been arranged to produce a false picture, and the only way to see through it is to ask a question that the pattern is specifically designed to prevent from being asked. The question would have been, what if the forces we cannot observe are larger than the forces we can observe? What if the quietness in the North is not the absence of preparation, but the presence of concealment? The German intelligence system did not ask that question consistently or in time, not because the officers involved were incompetent, but because asking it would have required them to doubt the reliability of multiple independent sources simultaneously and to construct an alternative picture from the absence of evidence rather than the presence of it. That is not a natural analytical process. It requires a specific kind of institutional culture that explicitly trains against mirror imaging, against the assumption that the enemy's intentions are as visible as your own, against the professional satisfaction that comes from a consistent intelligence picture. The Soviet planners who designed Maskirovka understood this analytical vulnerability. They had spent years studying how German intelligence processed information. They knew what the Germans trusted, what they cross-referenced, what patterns they recognized. The deception was built for the specific analytical culture. It was designed to deceive. After the war, German officers who had served on the Eastern Front and who were interviewed by the United States Army Historical Division in the 1950s and 1960s as part of the Foreign Military Studies program returned again and again to the question of Soviet operational surprise in 1944. Their accounts share a common quality. They describe the opening of Operation Bagration not as a surprise in the sense of an unexpected attack, but as a surprise in the sense of an attack of unexpected size, from an unexpected direction, by forces whose existence they had not identified. The forces had existed. They had moved. They had assembled. The preparation had been conducted on a scale that involved millions of men and tens of thousands of vehicles. It had simply been conducted in a manner that the German intelligence system could not see. General Hans Jordan, who commanded the German Ninth Army in the Barbarossa sector and was relieved of command on the second day of the offensive, later wrote a detailed operational account of battle that is preserved in the Foreign Military Studies collection. Jordan described the opening of the offensive as a moment of fundamental disorientation, in which the map of the situation he had understood to be accurate was suddenly and completely replaced by a different map. The forces that should not have been in front of him were in front of him. The reserves that should have been available were committed elsewhere based on an assessment that was no longer valid. The front that had been prepared for an attack it did not expect was receiving an attack it was not prepared for. Jordan wrote that the speed with which the Soviet forces exploited their initial penetrations made it impossible to establish a new defensive line before the penetrations had become encirclements. The tactical response was consistently too slow because the operational picture that should have driven the tactical response had been wrong from the beginning. This is what it means for an army to be defeated before the battle begins. Not that the outcome is inevitable once fighting starts, but that the decisions made in the weeks and months before the battle, the positioning of forces, the allocation of reserves, the orientation of supply lines, are made on the basis of a picture that is wrong, and that correcting those decisions once the battle begins requires more time than the battle allows. The Soviet forces that crossed the start line on June 22, 1944, were moving through a German defense that had been shaped by 6 months of careful attention to information that had been provided for exactly that purpose. By the time the German command understood what it was facing, the question of how to position forces had been replaced by the question of how to save what remained. 500 miles is an approximation. The actual distance varies depending on the measurement point and the end point of the pursuit. What is not an approximation is that the front line of Army Group Center in early June 1944 was in Belarus, deep inside Soviet territory. By the end of August, what remained of Army Group Center was fighting on the approaches to Warsaw, on the borders of East Prussia, on the edge of the territory that Germany itself had occupied in 1939. The army had retreated to the borders of the Reich in 2 months. Field Marshal Busch, relieved after 6 days, spent the rest of the war in reserve. He died in British captivity in July 1945, 2 months after Germany surrendered. His successor, Model, continued to command German forces in a series of increasingly desperate defensive operations through the autumn of 1944 and into 1945. Model committed suicide in April 1945 rather than surrender. Zhukov and Vasilevsky, the 2 marshals who had coordinated Operation Bagration, both survived the war and received its highest honors. Rokossovsky was made a Marshal of the Soviet Union, but Gromyen received the same promotion. Cherniakovsky, the youngest of the front commanders, was killed in February 1945 near Königsberg by artillery fire, 18 months after the offensive that had destroyed Army Group Center. The soldiers who conducted the Maskirovka, who drove trucks through the night without headlights, who maintained radio silence, who camouflaged guns under trees and moved them in the last hours before the attack, who sustained the discipline of concealment across hundreds of miles of front for months, are not named in the operational histories. They are not names. They are the weight and the patience behind the plan, the physical reality of what Maskirovka required of the men who implemented it. A deception operation of the scale of Bagration does not succeed because the planners are clever. It succeeds because every soldier in the assembly area maintains his camouflage. Every driver keeps his lights off. Every radio operator follows his transmission schedule. Every forward observer holds his registration fire. The cleverness is in the design. The discipline is in the execution. And the discipline, maintained across millions of men over months of preparation, is what the German intelligence system encountered when it looked north and saw nothing. It saw nothing because the men were there, and they had been trained to be invisible. On July 17, 1944, 57,600 German prisoners of war captured in the Bagration offensive were marched through the streets of Moscow. The march had been organized by Stalin as a demonstration of what the Soviet army had accomplished. The prisoners marched in columns through the center of the city, while Moscow civilians lined the streets and watched in silence. Behind the columns, street sweepers with hoses washed the pavement. The gesture was deliberate. The prisoners had passed. The streets were being cleaned. The German army had retreated 500 miles and never fully understood what had hit it. The soldiers who survived the encirclements and the prisoner columns went into captivity in conditions that killed a significant portion of them before the war ended. The officers who survived long enough to be interrogated gave accounts of a battle they had been unprepared for and could not explain with the information available to them at the time. The information that would have explained it, the patient months of night movement and radio silence and pre-surveyed guns and false traffic patterns, had been specifically constructed to be unavailable to them. They had been defeated by what they could not see, and what they could not see had been made invisible by the men who understood exactly how they were looking.